Hey, Jonah.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
Good, good. Well, here we are for another kind of rank punditry session of What's Your Problem?
That's right. And note to viewers, or I guess viewers is right, I am using my brand new MacBook Pro thing, which has the built-in camera, so if there are technological issues that come up with this, I apologize, and we'll fix them down the road.
That's right. And also we should acknowledge that we did consider having a discussion purely about the effects of everything that's happened on Wall Street and their ramifications for the international financial system, and then we both decided we just weren't smart enough to discuss it.
Truth be told, we got into a huge debate about the role of LIBOR and international liquidity, and we just decided that it was too technical an argument.
Yeah, that's right. We have to speak language people can understand.
All right, but since we're on the topic of financial apocalypse, why don't we talk about how it's going to play in politics, which is sort of more in everyone's comfort zone. I got to tell you, I think this sort of reflex punditry that you hear from everybody, starting, I don't know, with you to Charlie Cook to basically every single Democratic or liberal spokesperson or intellectual or pundit, is that moving the election to the economy is this no-brainer, obvious advantage for Barack Obama. And Jim Garrity actually went through a slew of polls on the blog, on his blog at NRO, the Campaign Spot blog, which is actually an incredibly useful blog. And in poll after poll, the reality is that McCain and Obama are essentially tied on the issue of who would be better on economics. And it is not obvious that economics is this slam dunk issue for Barack Obama. And beyond that, I think there's this assumption, and I think unfortunately that McCain shares this assumption, because I think they've screwed up in the last couple days, that he should be uncomfortable talking about economics. And while obviously this financial meltdown thing has a lot of different angles to it, and a big part of the story is obviously Wall Street and all of that kind of thing, an even bigger, or at least a more convenient target for McCain is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which, while they are while there's been bipartisan abuse in terms of Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think that the Democrats are far more implicated in what's happened in the mortgage crisis. Barack Obama is second only to Chris Dodd, which is an amazing thing in terms of taking money from the Freddie Mac crowd and the Fannie Mae crowd. And he wanted to have that guy from Fannie Mae running his VP vetting process. And you can just sort of go down the list.
Well, he did get rid of him, though. It's worth
but not because he was tied. Not because of this stuff. Because of the countrywide scandal thing. But it just shows. I mean, again, it's a prestige thing. But regardless, for McCain, it seems to me that rather than attacking, the greed of Wall Street, which clangs in the ears of a lot of people on the right, much better to go against the sort of corrupt bipartisan, if he wants, corrupt bipartisan political class that has been enriching itself through campaign donations and the rest at the expense of the economy and the expense of the taxpayer. I mean, it seems perfectly in his wheelhouse and a better issue for him. And third and last, while Obama may have a better issue on the economy than McCain, again, the polls don't necessarily support that, McCain has a clear advantage on the issue of leadership in a crisis and on the leadership issue generally. And I think he was really thrown back on his heels by Obama in the sort of daily news cycle stuff in the last couple of days by changing his message and being defensive on the fundamentals of the economy are a strong thing. He should have defended himself, saying, look, in a crisis, you don't go around, spreading panic. You want to, it's time for adult leadership. And it's true that the fundamentals of the economy are still basically strong. And instead, he caved to Obama's message. But I think if McCain can right himself on this stuff, it's not at all clear to me that Obama has this incredible advantage.
Well, I mean, I think you make a good point in that Obama's advantage on the economy should be bigger than it is. If you look at the generic advantage that Democrats have, and I think that there is, I think he is not so far done as good a job as he needs to do in terms of exploiting, I think, the potential advantage he has on the economy. I think there is a potential advantage he has, and we'll see whether it starts to emerge now. And I think he has a potential advantage for a couple of reasons. The first is, I just think he's more fluent in talking about these issues than McCain is, and he shows more interest. I mean, he may not be as good as Bill Clinton, but he seems better versed on this stuff, and he seems more genuinely interested. I mean, McCain still has this problem of seeming, unlike when you talk about national security, to not really feel like he has a very firm grasp of the material, and also feel like he really wishes he were anywhere else doing anything else. And I think maybe he can overcome that, but there is a striking consistency. One of the things that people have said in McCain's defense, which is likable about him, and I agree, is that he's not a good liar. He's a little like Bob Dole. He's not good at feigning emotions and interest when they're not there. And I think that is a little bit of the problem he has here. The other potential advantage that I think Obama has is the one that I think you kind of got at a little bit, which is that, sure, McCain can attack lobbyists. Of course, Obama can do that as well, and McCain has his own lobbyists. But the ideological problem that McCain has, which I think you got at a little bit, is that what the public wants, and in fact I would argue the most obvious, at least intellectual response to this, is to talk about a need for regulation, the failures of lack of oversight and regulation. And that is, I think that points out the just difficult ideological moment that Republicans are in, because there is a conservative orthodoxy which is hostile, of course, to regulation, and is not willing to admit, by and large, that almost any event suggests that you need more government regulation. But that's probably where the public is. And so McCain is now facing this situation that he often has to face on economic issues, of potentially alienating the business part of his base, or making an argument that doesn't sound very conservative.
Well, I think if you're talking about his relationship to his base, I think you're right. Where I thought you were going to go is where a lot of the rest of the press has gone, including the Washington Post on Wednesday morning, with this idea that McCain is this sort of impassioned and dedicated deregulator. Marty Peretz put up, I know he's a buddy of yours, but he put up a remarkably uninformed and silly blog post about this today or yesterday. This idea, and
I don't think he's a dedicated and passionate anything when it comes to economics. I mean, that's where I disagree. But anyway,
look, I mean, if I went by, I don't know, the things I read in the New Republic and the American Prospect over the last 6 or 7 years about John McCain and his attempts to take on oil companies and drug companies and his endorsement of cap and trade and his eagerness to sort of leap in and start regulating professional baseball. You can go through, a long list of things that caused your magazine, when you were the editor, to talk about making McCain the Democratic nominee. And
well, to be fair, there was always it's a very interesting question, actually, but there's always really been a division, even going back to that period, amongst liberals and even within places like the New Republic about McCain. But there is no question that there were some people, particularly in the late 1990s, who took that point of view. But many of them, like John Chait, have kind of recanted. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, John Chait recanted it doesn't change what.
No, but it's also possible McCain has shifted his point of view since then.
That's fine, but it doesn't change the facts that caused you guys to think one way about him in the first place.
No, at a certain moment, no.
And so anyway, I mean, I think this idea that McCain is this sort of Gingrichian or Phil Grahamian deregulator is really just, at least in terms of just media coverage, a really incredibly large disservice to the American people in terms of how they're telling that story. And it's one of the reasons why the conservative base couldn't stand McCain in a lot of ways, was because of his impulse towards regulation on things like campaign finance reform and the like. But I agree with you that it would create a certain wedge that got him between his base and the swing voters if he just did this Wall Street greed stuff, which is what he's doing right now. Which is all the more reason why I don't understand why he's not making this about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is sort of the fons et origio of the mortgage crisis, and that's where, at least in my limited understanding of these markets, that's the thrust where the momentum of this crisis is coming from. And I agree with you. He doesn't like to talk about economics in a theoretical way. Very few people do in politics. But what he is very good at is translating things into this morality tale. Good guys versus bad guys kind of thing. And that's what he did as a regulator in the Senate for a long time. That's what he did. That's what the earmarks thing has always been about with him. Mm-hmm. That's what that fuel tanker thing was about. And I don't understand why his advisors are telling him to get out of his comfort zone or get crosswise with his base, and by my lights, sort of be wrong on policy, when it would be so much easier to get him to go off against, Barney Frank, Chris Dodd, the Democrats in Congress. These people have given all of this money to Obama. It seems to me a very easy political issue for him, and I don't understand why he's blowing.
But, that may all be well and good, but McCain does have to say what he wants to do, right? You can say that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were corrupt, and you can focus on the fact that Democrats were in bed with them, although obviously they were bipartisan. But it seems to me, if he's going to seize this moment and stay as close to Obama on the polls on the economy as he is, he's got to suggest what he's going to do. And it seems to me bashing Obama for his connections with Freddie Mac, it doesn't answer that. You have to basically address the question, don't you, of whether you want some increased kind of regulation or you have some other alternative.
No, I think that's fine. I think he's sort of been doing that. Although it's kind of foggy exactly what he's proposing. Frankly, I think it's foggy what Obama is proposing. I thought it was really funny. Obama in his shot at McCain says, John McCain has taken out the oldest trick in the book and proposed a commission to study it. With McCain's 9/11 style commission on the financial crisis. And then a few minutes later, Obama talks about how he's going to form an advisory group, as if somehow that's a real different thing than a commission. In fact, I would say the commission thing is probably more teeth to it than an advisory group. But either way, I think both of them have been kind of fuzzy about this, in part because it's a fuzzy thing. It's a hard thing to talk about. It's a hard thing to talk about prospectively. In a way that doesn't either confuse the public or get you into a place where neither of these guys, I think, are all that comfortable.
Which is what? You mean just on
getting into the weeds on regulatory issues in the financial markets? I don't think either of these. I think your estimation of Obama off the teleprompter is far, far higher than mine, and I think that he makes all sorts of gaffes, which unfortunately in the media climate don't get the kind of coverage they deserve. But I don't think he's nearly as good, sort of off the cuff, as you do, which is why they had him reading off a teleprompter again yesterday to go after McCain, because I don't think he's comfortable talking about the nitty-gritty of these policy issues either.
I might take it different. We'll get a sense in these debates, but I think that I think Obama is more fluent talking about economic policy than McCain is. I think he's just analytically sharper, period. I think that McCain has other strengths as a human being, but I don't think McCain is incredibly analytically sharp. And I think that my suspicion is that if in some debate they are forced to go into the weeds, I think that the difference is actually going to be quite stark. I think McCain is really barely better in talking about these issues than George W. Bush was when he ran in 2000, and I think I think this is where obviously Sarah Palin is not helping him.
Yeah, we'll see. I hope that you are representative of the expectations out there, because I've really come to the conclusion that Obama is in many ways politically out of his depth.
What do you mean politically out of his depth?
He's never run against. He's never had run a competitive race against a Republican in his entire life. The only really competitive, serious race he's ever run at all and won was against Hillary Clinton, where he was trying to win the support of the left-wing base of the Democratic Party in a Democratic Party primary. And he barely did that by the skin of his teeth. He started losing all those primaries towards the end, which is sort of unheard of in primaries. I think he's very good at speaking to audiences that already agree with him, and very bad about speaking to audiences that don't agree with him. John Haaretz had a really interesting piece in Politico a few days ago about Bill Clinton's advice for Obama. And a big chunk of it was how Obama needs to get out of his comfort zone and start talking to people who don't already agree with him. And I think at Saddleback we saw this. I think we're going to see it at the debates. That we saw it with the bitter clinging to guns and religion stuff. He knows how to talk to people who already agree with him, and I think one of the reasons why you think he's so analytically sharp is because you're hearing him at that top 10% level where you're agreeing on a lot of your first assumptions about stuff. And I think that if you disagree with him on his first assumptions, he's really not that persuasive a guy. And he's not that, I believe he's an analytically sharp guy, and I'm sure he was a good con law professor and all of that kind of stuff. That's not my point. Politically, the way he talks about things, the way he slices and dices the world, sounds really persuasive to people who already agree with him, but not that much to people who don't, which is one of the reasons why he very rarely can get above 50% anywhere.
Well, the truth will be on election day to some degree, and look, if Obama loses, it is unlikely, I think, that there will be a strong move to not nominate someone as liberal as him again. There will be a lot of people who look back to Carter and Clinton and saw that they ran more to the center. And even if the Democrats renominated Obama, I suspect that it might be an Obama who was running a little bit more to the center. But this is if Obama loses, which I still think is less likely than he wins. And although it's true, he hasn't run many races, and obviously in Illinois he didn't face much Republican competition. And it is true he won in a Democratic primary. Let's not overlook too quickly what an accomplishment it was to beat Hillary Clinton and the Clinton machine in the Democratic Party, something that most people thought was not possible. And the truth is that in these debates, which actually did not really lend themselves to Obama's kind of flowing eloquence, where Hillary Clinton was really better than him early on, partly because she is just such a, she's been doing this policy wonkery, particularly on domestic policy, since 1923. Obama really ended up doing very well and holding his own, and I think that's no small accomplishment.
I agree with you. It's no small accomplishment, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's very good at persuading a general election audience about anything. I increasingly think we had this conversation last week about the race stuff. We don't need to get into it again. But, I think in many ways he's much more of a conventional sort of, Michael Dukakis, John Kerry, more eloquent to be sure, more charming to be sure.
Much more comfortable talking about his religious faith than those guys were.
But again, he's much more comfortable talking about it. But if you actually look at the polls, not effective. He's not bringing over any evangelicals. In fact, McCain's doing better and better among evangelicals. I don't think he's even worried about evangelicals anymore.
Well, let's see if he gets the base turnout that Bush got in 2004, which he might need to win in some.
No, that's true. I'm not saying but my point is that if you look at all the indices of that are supposed to be indicative that Obama is a different kind of Democrat who has this cross-party appeal. You've been making these references to how he's sort of like a liberal Reagan and reaches across the middle. He doesn't reach across the middle. He has no record of reaching across the middle except rhetorically. And you look, the New York Times just had this piece about Catholics in Scranton, who Joe Biden, who again I think was a terrible pick, was supposed to wrap up. And going by this New York Times piece of all things, I'm increasingly confident that Obama Biden is going to underperform Kerry Edwards in Scranton. The Catholic vote out there, again, if Obama is so good about talking about his faith and Biden is so good about being a working class Catholic guy, you'd think they would be doing better, but there seems to be no indication of that from actual on the ground reporting that all these Hillary Democrats are going to be voting for McCain.
Look, there's no question that Obama in the polls is not doing as well as a lot of Democrats, myself, expected him to do. It is worth noting that Obama has some strengths that other Democrats don't have, and maybe is weaker than them in other areas. I mean, when you look at the fact that Obama might be struggling in a state like Ohio, or even maybe he's not doing quite as well with Pennsylvania, it's probably worth remembering he may have more appeal in the West. He may have a better chance at winning Virginia. So this is slightly different. But I think the other point to make when one talks about this is he is running against another guy. And in John McCain, I mean, I think this is one of the fascinating things about this fascinating election. I think, without quite meaning to, the Republican Party did choose the one candidate, maybe aside from Rudy Giuliani, who genuinely did have a different persona from George W. Bush and from the standard generic Republican brand, and particularly did have a potential for greater strength in the North because he was not as associated with the kind of Sun Belt, very libertarian, very Christian right kind of Republican brand that has often turned people off there. And I think the success so far of the Palin pick is that McCain has strengthened himself with evangelicals without having surrendered that kind of valuable brand that he had. And I think if Obama were running against a somewhat more conventional Republican, I think you might see that he had more of that advantage right now. But we still don't know. He may have it by Election Day.
No, again, you may be right. But I think one of the things you just pointed out is why this making McCain into Bush thing doesn't work nearly as well as the Democrats want it to. I mean, obviously Bush is unpopular. Obviously the tactic has some benefit to it or some merit to it. But McCain is one of the most well-known politicians in American life, who has been, sort of ironically, built up by the same press that's now trying to tear him down as not George Bush. And it seems to me that you can't that this still relatively unknown newcomer to American politics in terms of Barack Obama can't come in and tell people that what they know isn't true about John McCain very easily. Well, and most of the surrogates that they're using come from a Democratic Congress that's actually more unpopular than George Bush. So the idea that somehow just saying over and over again McCain equals Bush, when people have been watching and reading the news for over a decade and being told again and again and again that McCain isn't George Bush, it seems to me that you have to work harder than just saying it over and over again. And again, I think it's an example of something that polls really well or gets a really good reaction from people who are already sold on Obama, but it doesn't sound all that persuasive to the independent swing voter, moderate Republicans, and conservative Democrats.
Well, I think they may actually have some evidence. I've heard suggestions that actually it does work pretty well in focus groups, but I guess a couple points on what you said. First of all, I think this argument about how unpopular the Democratic Congress is a bit of a red herring, because it's like 1994. None of these Democratic congressmen or senators are in jeopardy of losing their seats. It's the Republicans who are in jeopardy of losing their seats. So I think the anti-Washington feeling right now, as it did in 1994 in the opposite direction, has a very sharp partisan edge. I do think that one of the fascinating, I think, and underappreciated changes in the dynamic of the election has been the way Iraq has receded as an issue. And I do think that has had an impact, and here I agree with you, has had an impact on the difficulty of framing Bush as McCain as Bush 3. I think one of the reasons that there really was an opportunity to frame McCain as Bush 3 was because by last year, McCain's entire political identity, this is what made it so different than 2000, had really become seen through the lens of the war in Iraq. And of course, on the war in Iraq, he and George W. Bush really are joined at the hip. I mean, there it really is true. He is as much the author of Bush's Iraq policy as Bush is, practically. And in a way, because Obama has now talks less about Iraq, partly because of the complicating factor of the surge, partly because of the perception that Americans care more about the economy. It's if it's a domestic policy election, it's a little harder to paint McCain as Bush 3 than it would be if it were still an Iraq-dominated election. I think maybe that's one of the reasons that it hasn't succeeded as well as they would have hoped so far. Again, I think it's important to say so far.
Yeah, I think all that's fair, except we're not going to get into all this because we need to move on, but I think the idea that McCain and Bush are completely joined at the hip on Iraq is something that is much harder to prove to the average voter than I think you think it is. I mean, McCain, lost confidence in Romney and all of that kind of stuff. All of that would make for very good ads.
Well, so did Bush eventually. McCain was a little ahead of him, but...
Well, yeah, but I mean, look, McCain was for, a more aggressive approach to Iraq from the get-go. I think McCain would be very good.
Not from the get-go. There was still a period where he was saying everything is great. To his credit, he did flip. He did
right, okay,
turn more...
But I mean, I think the idea that saying that McCain was basically following Bush or is Bush 3 on foreign policy would, given the torture stuff, given the wiretapping stuff, given all sorts of areas where, not the wiretapping stuff, but the torture stuff, there are all sorts of areas where McCain has, pretty vocally broken with Bush. And even if the issue climate were different than what it is, I still think that the McCain is Bush thing would, A, on the merits, not be true, and therefore should reflect badly on someone who keeps saying it, or that party who keeps saying it. And two, I don't think would be as effective as a lot of people think it would be. But since we're talking about whether or not McCain is, or would be, Bush 2, why don't we switch to another topic that you want to talk about, which is how McCain would actually how would McCain actually govern?
Yeah, and maybe we could do another segment at some point on this question about the similarities and differences between Bush and McCain foreign policy, because it's actually I don't think they are. I mean, there are differences, but I think there are also there are ways in which you could say that actually McCain is a more authentic Bush than Bush, and came to Bushism before Bush even did something I've been thinking about a little bit. So we could that would be a good topic for the future.
Okay.
On the I wrote this piece in Time a couple weeks ago, which basically made this point that a McCain presidency could be very, very tough for the Republicans. There's no question that even if McCain wins, the Republican Party as a brand is having real trouble in terms of, and there, you could all kinds of indices for this. And the question is how the Republicans get their juice back. And seems to me you can argue, the point I made is that there are two ways that a party can kind of get its mojo back. The one is if they're out of power and the guys in power do stuff that's unpopular that they can really exploit, like Gingrich did in response to the first couple of years of Bill Clinton. The second is if you have the presidency and you can pass some legislation that people on your side and that the American people in general kind of like, and you can kind of bond them to you, as Reagan did with his tax cuts in 1981, or even Bush did with his tax cuts in his early response to 9/11. So if Obama wins with the Democratic Congress, they try to pass universal health care, immigration legislation, and some new environmental regulations, and maybe they withdraw from Iraq. I can imagine Republicans all of a sudden saying, "Okay, yeah, now I remember why I'm a Republican. This is firing me up again." I think it seems to me the problem you have with the McCain presidency is you have a president who has not shown exactly what you would call stalwart dedication to the conservative domestic agenda to begin with. Facing what will be probably large, aggressive Democratic majorities, a guy who seems to be most concerned about foreign policy rather than domestic policy. And you face the prospect that McCain might go ahead and sign that immigration bill that he worked up with Ted Kennedy and the Democrats with Democratic votes, a global warming bill that I might like, that with Democratic votes, maybe something on torture or detainees with Democratic votes that I might like, that he very well might make some kind of deal on the budget that Democrats would like more than Republicans would like, that there are a whole series of things, given McCain's history and the nature of the Democratic Congress, where the governing could be significantly to the left, a la kind of Richard Nixon. And maybe McCain would do that partly to try to gain some maneuver room on foreign policy that he felt like he could do what he wanted, along with David Petraeus. And I would imagine, you tell me if I'm wrong, that this would have an extremely demoralizing effect on the conservative base. I mean, particularly some kind of immigration legislation that was perceived in the Rush Limbaugh world to be amnesty. And this could produce a kind of degree of alienation from the Republican Party by base conservatives that we really haven't seen since, Pat Buchanan ran against George Bush's father in 1992 after he broke his no new taxes pledge. So there really is potentially kind of a perilous situation you could imagine for conservatives if McCain wins the presidency, on domestic policy at least.
Yeah, I certainly think it's absolutely fair to say there's that potential. particularly on the immigration stuff. Mark Krikorian, Mickey Kaus, and a few others have been, making this argument for a while that, conservatives are proving themselves to be, that conservatives, particularly concerned with immigration, are proving themselves to be pretty cheap dates when it comes to McCain. And so I agree entirely that it's possible. I think you and I would disagree about where the probability is, but we probably both agree that neither of us actually know what the probability is. So I think it's a perfectly fair concern that you hear from time to time on the right. It seems to me there are a couple things. One is I think that conservatives, and this is my own personal view, is that I think conservatives would actually be invigorated and helped somewhat to have a more transactional relationship with the White House. One of the reasons the conservative movement got itself in a rut in the last 10 years, or during the Bush years, is because Bush sort of had this identity politics appeal to conservatives. He was born again, which bada bing got him a lot of evangelical support, just the way he talked about religion and all that kind of stuff. He was culturally, both Ramesh Ponnuru and Jonathan Chait and others have argued about how presidents have become essentially symbols in the culture war, or the leading symbols in the culture war, and I basically agree with that, which is one of the reasons why I think Obama's got bigger troubles than people think they do. And I think that a lot of people on the right bought into Bush because he was our icon in the culture war, which is sort of an identity politics kind of argument, is that he represents something rather than he believes something. And I think conservatives could actually be helped somewhat by having a more sort of Nixonian relationship with the White House, where the White House says, we promise...
You might want to rephrase that, but yeah.
Well, no, I'm not sure. Promise, people forget Nixon hated the Buckleyites and did not like the Goldwaterites at all. There were deep animosities there. The Goldwaterites helped get, Nixon, helped fight for Nixon in a big way in the 1960s and in 1960, but the Nixonians tried to screw Goldwater at every term in '64, and those wounds were deep and abiding.
But isn't Nixon exactly the problem, based on your analysis, which is that Nixon did not believe what conservatives believed. He governed fairly to the left, but his whole political success was that he made himself an emblem of the culture war, identifying with the silent majority.
Yeah, no, but my point is that I think that if McCain could make implicit or explicit promises to the right about the Supreme Court, about taxes, a handful of things, it would be good for the right not to sort of in lockstep say this is good because our guy says it's good. And I think that you've heard me do this spiel for a long time. I generally think it's a sign of health for a political movement to have big fights internal to itself rather than have sort of groupthink. And I think that we had too much groupthink over the last few years. That said, while it could pose particular challenges for conservatives, some of them that might actually help conservatives build up their muscle, mass a little bit more, I think McCain might actually have a pretty good shot at coming across as a fairly Clintonian president in the following way, that Clinton basically, especially after the debacle of the first year or so with the healthcare stuff and the gays and the military stuff, basically hugged the center throughout most of his presidency, and with all the triangulation stuff, I think McCain could, regardless of whether he would be championing the issues I want him to champion or be successful in the areas that I would want him to be successful, I think it's measured just in terms of a successful presidency by getting what he wants and getting, and doing and moving the ball in the direction that he wants to move it. He could actually be pretty well placed, because I think you underestimate the ability of the Democratic Party to go insane very quickly if they lose this. And McCain could very easily, I think, cobble together a pretty good working coalition of conservative Democrats and moderate to ball-playing Republicans, and govern from the center and use the gnashing of teeth and rending of cloth from both the far left and the far right to his advantage. Now, again, on the policy issues, that doesn't necessarily mean I would be delighted, and it would be, it could. I think you're right. It could cause a real mess on the right, depending on the policy area. But in terms of branding the Republican Party as the majority party in this country, which Bill Clinton at times seemed like he was on his way to do with the Democratic Party, it would be a bigger. I think McCain. You make an argument. McCain would be a much bigger success for Republicans than he would be for sort of committed conservatives like me.
Well, yeah. I guess the question I have is, given that,
and I'm just thinking this through. I may change my mind.
Yeah, I mean, given that the conservatives obviously do dominate the base of the Republican Party, they are the foot soldiers of the Republican Party. It's not as if the Republican Party anymore has much of a functioning moderate wing. I mean, the question is, if he makes compromises, even if the left of the Democratic Party is not entirely thrilled with him, on immigration, on environmental issues, on taxes and budgetary issues, on health care, is there if you're going to build a I can see that you could attract some independents and maybe even some less partisan Democrats, and might say, oh, that's I'm looking at McCain in a different way now, and that would strengthen his kind of nonpartisan independent maverick brand. But it does seem to me that I wonder, in 1996, Democrats held their noses and supported Bill Clinton in huge numbers, even though he had supported welfare reform, and even though he had basically taken an approach to economics that was very, Eisenhower-esque kind of fiscal conservative. I just wonder whether the Republican Party foot soldiers base are in the mood to do that with McCain if he does the equivalent.
I guess the answer is I don't know. I mean, I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to wonder about. I don't think it has much bearing on people's enthusiasm for this election, one way or the other, because at times like this, everyone starts shedding their entirely legitimate, long-term goals and concerns, and start focusing on winning. And I think that, especially since Palin, or even a little bit before that, basically ever since the celebrity ad kind of thing. The Republican Party has been coalescing around the idea that it actually does want to win this thing, and there may in fact be some buyer's remorse. I mean, I think that there's another thing to think about, is that if the Democratic Congress is as aggressive in pursuing its agenda as I think it's reasonable to assume, McCain's presidency may in many ways be defined as a veto presidency. He'll be the guy who gets to say no to a very liberal Congress, and
if that's decided, if he wants to play it that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, he may. I don't know the answer to it, but he may see the political advantage, at least in some areas, of doing that, because the only way to sort of keep the right in line is to occasionally hold up the Medusa's head of the Democratic Congress to petrify, his own side and say, look, it's me or them. And certainly, I think, the fairly whorish, business lobby will get in line with a lot of that. Because as bad as McCain would be by the lights of a lot of Chamber of Commerce crowd people, he would be infinitely better, I think, in their eyes than, what a Nancy Pelosi or a Barney Frank or, those guys would want to do. And on the cultural issues, I think he just has to be very careful. Again, the 800-pound landmine gorilla, whatever, is immigration. And we all know where his instincts are. He's running these ads in Spanish-language media that differ from his English-language message. And that's the one thing where I think, if your scenario proves to be right, and I truly don't know whether I think it's likely or not, but if your scenario proves to be right, it's almost guaranteed it would be over the issue of immigration.
Well,
and that's...
I totally agree. Well, maybe we should move on, since we were talking about culture war, and you mentioned Palin. Maybe we should move on to our Sarah Palin conversation. Sure. Everybody has talked about Sarah Palin, but you and I have not. So, and the reason that occurred to me to talk about Palin, which I thought was kind of interesting, was I thought it was kind of interesting to notice the kind of group of conservative pundits who have been critical of Palin recently. David Frum, in your magazine, National Review, online, was critical, and I think David Brooks wrote this column, and I think there are a couple of others as well. I think Ross Duhat, a couple others have been critical. And what really intrigued me about Frum and his criticism of Palin was, it harkened back to his criticism of Harriet Miers, where he basically said, at least as I kind of remembered it, look, liberals keep on saying that we are the anti-intellectual party. It's not true. We have a lot of intellectual firepower. I don't like the idea of us playing into this stereotype by choosing, in Harriet Miers and now Sarah Palin, one amongst our ranks who really doesn't have the chops intellectually to make the conservative argument. And it reminded me of an argument that you and I have had over the years about the perils and also the benefits of populism, which is to say that it seems to me that the great advantage of Sarah Palin's had in the Republican for McCain so far is that she has allowed Republicans to feel as if they are culturally embattled, that the pointy-headed liberal elites are looking down their noses at them, which is a position that has been very useful for conservatives and Republicans to all the way going back to Joseph McCarthy. This has been a very successful trope. And yet it's interesting to me that there are some conservative intellectuals who really don't seem to like playing this game very much, because although maybe they would acknowledge that it could have some political benefits, they don't like the anti-intellectualism that seems to come along with it, because it does reaffirm the stereotypes that liberals have of conservatives as being non-intellectual, which I happen to think is generally wrong. But it does play into that narrative. So I wonder if you've sensed that dynamic at all.
Well, yeah, I don't want to, just because I haven't read Frum stuff on Palin since like his initial reaction. I don't want to mischaracterize him or get into a fight with David when I'm not up to speed on it. But in terms of the way you characterize the argument, a few things come to mind. First is, I just, for the record, I need to say that the way you characterize this sort of, we're being picked on by the pointy heads and the condescending cultural elite stuff, regardless of when it may have been used or abused or dishonestly used or whatever in the past or in the future, we can have that argument another time. In the case of Palin, whatever the merits of the larger argument that Frum or these other anti-Palin conservatives are making, in the case of Palin, it is actually objectively true that there has been no shortage of the most asinine and repugnant belittling of Sarah Palin that I have seen of any public figure out of the blocks in a very long time. You've got columnists, and you got this feminist professor from University of Chicago writing in Newsweek that Sarah Palin's most offensive hypocrisy is her pretense that she's actually a woman. You've got stuff coming out of Salon, which is so unbelievably stupid and condescending about Palin. You've got the New York Times getting its dress over its head about Sarah Palin's kid's pregnancy. You've got Hannah Rosen, who I like, personally and all of that, going straight after her quote-unquote wreck of a family life, straight out of the blocks. You've got Sally Quinn. It is a parade of horribles, of liberal cultural condescension about Sarah Palin, that if the situation were reversed, the screams and shrieks of sexism.
The situation is reversed, though, Jonah. I mean, look at what that guy Corsi said about Barack Obama. The situation is reversed. So, can you find people saying offensive things about Sarah Palin? Of course you can. I'm not sure that there are people.
Jerome Corsi does not equal Sally Quinn, the New York Times, Newsweek, the entire MSNBC network, including Andrea Mitchell,
why not?
The New York Times editors, the Washington Post editors. Come on. Jerome Corsi has been criticized by all sorts of people on the right.
So these people. He was also given a basically permanent platform on Fox and conservative talk radio, and not to mention, if you want to go back to John Kerry and how mainstream the attacks, Michelle Malkin is a mainstream figure on the conservative. I don't see her blackballed. I don't see Ann Coulter blackballed. The kind of stuff they've said about Democrats over the years. I'm just saying. Let's not all of a sudden start pretending that very nasty personal stuff about people running for president or vice president is the province of the left.
Yeah, but what you're doing, that's fine, but you're changing the subject.
No,
I'm saying
you said this is unprecedented or something.
No, I'm saying it's unprecedented in terms of the incredible, dripping cultural condescension that is coming from, whatever the merits of or demerits of Ann Coulter and Michelle Malkin and Jerome Corsi. They do not control the commanding heights of American political culture the way the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, and these other places do. It's just it is an apples and oranges comparison, and the way they have gone after Sarah Palin on just whether you think it's fair or not is to me immaterial. The simple fact is that's the way it's been received, which is why we've gotten huge numbers of people moving to the McCain ticket as a backlash against what they perceive as the mainstream media's attack on Sarah Palin.
Well, that's your interpretation of why they've done it. We don't have. You have any evidence that that's why they moved to McCain and Palin?
A lot of anecdotal, but
I could hypothesize another reason that there's been a move towards McCain and Palin other than that.
I'm sure you can, but I think that regardless, I just want to be on the record, but we can have another argument about it another day. That's fine, but. In terms of the way you sort of framed it as this idea that this is just simply a useful sort of tool in Lee Atwater's quiver to go after the nattering nabobs of negativism and the cultural elite and all that kind of stuff, whether that's been used fairly or unfairly in the past or whatever, it has the merit of actually being true in my opinion about Sarah Palin. Now, in terms of the Frummian argument, or what was initially the Panurvian argument, or the Brooksian argument about Palin, let's take the David Brooks thing. I think that I was very schizophrenic about David's column. As you know, I'm a fan of David's, but I think David has a lot of wishful thinking about where he wants politics to be, and he keeps finding it and writing about it, even though he's really writing from a sense of sort of wish fulfillment than reality, in my opinion. But in terms of Palin, I agree with him about the elitism stuff. You've heard me argue about this plenty of times. I like elitism, right? I think it is one of these weird things that in our politics, politics is the only area where we throw away our admiration for elitism rightly understood, right? Which is essentially meritocracy, the Jeffersonian elect, where we love the elite surgeons, we love elite soldiers, we want elite lawyers defending us in court, but all of a sudden when it comes to politicians, the language has been corrupted so that I think the right is largely to blame for this.
Because we want politicians to be like us in a way that we don't necessarily want our surgeon or our soldier to be like us, right?
I think that's right. I think part of it is the category error of what politics is about versus these other things. But in terms of sort of intellectualism and all of the rest, I like the Claremont Review of Books more than I like right-wing talk radio, and I think there's nothing to be ashamed of about that. And so I agree with David when he's talking about how conservatives have become too enamored with strictly populist arguments, where I think David is analytically just sort of wrong, is investing this argument so heavily in John McCain's vice presidential pick, or his argument that somehow George Bush proves that Sarah Palin is a bad governing pick. George Bush surrounded himself with probably the most experienced team of advisors that we've seen in a Republican administration in years. And the idea that Rumsfeld and Powell and Cheney and all these guys were Palin-esque sort of stretches the comparison pretty badly. They may have been anti-establishment in some ways, but they weren't Sarah Palin in that way. And since it's only because of Gore and Cheney that we have come to think of the vice president as this incredibly important and serious position. I think it's entirely fair to say that Sarah Palin isn't quite ready for prime time, at least as evidenced by what we've seen so far. But in the history of vice presidents, that's hardly anything new. If you look at some of the schmucks that FDR picked, for vice president, including, the former editor of the New Republic.
Hey, Henry Wallace, whatever you want to say, he was no intellectual slouch. I mean, Harry Truman was the guy who really, hadn't gone to college and really just seemed intellectually totally out of his depth.
Well, which I think, Steve Hayward made the point that Harry Truman is a pretty good, and I guess Palin made the point too in her speech, that Harry Truman is a sort of good model for where they see Palin coming from. And again, I mean, the Henry Wallace thing, we should do one of these on Henry Wallace sometime.
He knew a lot about agriculture.
He knew a lot about agriculture. He was also into all sorts of spiritual mumbo jumbo, and he was, he surrounded himself with either communist sympathizers or communist spies. But beyond that, he was brilliant.
I have my differences with Henry Wallace as well, but I do think, to get back to the Palin pick, look, it's true that sometimes people come to the presidency without very much experience, and they have some inner fortitude that really, a good, just salt of the earth, horse sense judgment that really comes through and serves them very well. But it does seem to me that the right has become, this clearly happens, but the right has become a little bit too enamored, it seems to me, with this narrative. That in a strange kind of way, it seems to me that some conservatives, this started with Reagan, which I think some conservatives, I think is not entirely fair to Reagan. Some conservatives have now argued this, about Reagan was actually much more knowledgeable about policy, even though he was terrible on details and stuff, that he had actually been immersed in these debates for many, many, many decades. He wrote these radio scripts by his own hand, and I think there's some truth to that.
He beat Bobby Kennedy in a debate about Vietnam, according to Bobby Kennedy himself.
Well, that's true. That's not the same as being informed. Reagan was...
No, true.
But I think that actually Reagan, in a way, was quite deeply... It wasn't just that he had gut instincts about things. Those gut instincts had been played out over decades and decades of big policy debates. And I think, in a way, there's been a kind of move from Reagan to Bush, and a feeling that, Bush is Reagan-esque because he doesn't really have great command of the details either, but he has some kind of, salt-of-the-earth horse sense. And now, this is now transferred onto Palin, and I feel like... sometimes this can work out, but it seems to me it's not, in general, the best bet. In general, it seems to me you're better off, and I think this is what David Frum is trying to get at a little bit, I think, you're better off taking someone who actually agrees with you and can explain your point of view and think it through in some detail and depth. And that, and I think that Palin, while she may be helping politically, she is just furthering, cementing this particular kind of populist narrative in the Republican Party, which I'm not sure is going to serve very well for governing. You can say she's not going to matter as a running mate, but that would be presumably a shame, since one would hope that a vice president could actually be a really helpful governing partner.
Yeah, look, I'm not saying that she's not going to matter necessarily. I just think that this investment in the cosmic significance of the vice president, the vice presidency, is a fairly novel concern, and I think that so far McCain's judgment about Palin, I think, has been borne out, certainly as a political phenomenon.
Oh, politically,
all these people said that McCain was an idiot politically for picking Palin, and they're all wrong now. I think that that's been demonstrated, and so he may be right about governing. Personally, I've been a fan of Palin in terms of her governing for quite a while. I was touting her for VP for a while, and I think she's still going to surprise a lot of people. But, we're talking about the vice president here, not the president. And again, I think it's really kind of shocking how much Obama gets a free pass for his vice presidential pick, who contradicts his entire campaign narrative as much as, if not more so, than McCain does. But regardless, in the history of the Republic, the vice presidential slot has usually been someone who rounds out something missing from the top of the ticket, right? That's why Obama picked Biden to a certain extent. That's why Bush picked Cheney to a certain extent. That's why, in some ways, Clinton-Gore is a little bit of a difference there because there was a generational play there. And to a certain extent, this is what, McCain picks Palin for. I mean, Palin also sort of reinforces this maverick change thing that McCain wanted to pick up in the general election. But it seems to me if you're David Brooks and you don't like this populist stuff, and you don't like and you want to minimize it, then having it as in the VP slot on the McCain ticket, when David Brooks has carried more water for John McCain over the last decade than Gunga Din, right? I mean, he was the one writing editorial after editorial in the Weekly Standard talking about how John McCain was basically, the guy who's going to save the republic. And meanwhile, the same, again, I mean, I know you'll disagree with this, but the same standards that he's sort of applying to Palin in many ways apply, to Obama just as much. This idea that he's this incredibly seasoned, experienced guy who has this judgment is, to me, still something of a fantasy.
I think that the counter-argument to that is to imagine Obama and Palin in a debate discussing policy on almost anything. And I think you would see that. But I also disagree with you on running mates. I would put it this way. I think there are two kinds of running mates. I think, obviously, nobody chooses a running mate who they think is going to hurt them politically. Probably Bush with Cheney was the running mate who actually was the clearest one, probably. Even Cheney probably helped Bush because he gave him the aura of experience. I think there are running mates that help you politically and that are also chosen with an eye to helping you govern. And I would put Gore for Clinton in that category. I would put Cheney for Bush in that category. I would put Biden for Obama. I would put LBJ for John F. Kennedy. One of the things these things tend to have in common is that you choose people who are more knowledgeable about Washington, the inside of Washington, than you are, and therefore can help you maneuver. Walter Mondale for Carter. The other is people who clearly don't really provide any benefit in terms of governing whatsoever, but simply provide a political benefit. And there I would think of George H.W. Bush choosing Dan Quayle, or Richard Nixon choosing Spiro Agnew, or John McCain choosing Sarah Palin. And I think you have to be, you can say, well, maybe this guy is so seasoned politically and has such great judgment they don't need a useful running mate, but I think there really is a difference. Biden will be an important and really valuable part of Obama's governing, and I think Palin will not. And if she becomes the president, and McCain is an old guy, then I think we're all going to wake up and we're going to ask ourselves some real questions. I mean, imagine Palin's the president right now, and she has to go into a meeting with Paulson and Bernanke and make the decision about whether to be one, and listen to them make competing arguments about whether to bail out AIG and split the tie. I mean, that's a pretty frightening prospect to me.
I won't lose sleep tonight about it, I'll tell you that. But I got to tell you, there are a whole bunch of things I disagree with. First of all, I asked this purely as a factual thing. I don't remember ever reading, in all of my reading about JFK, that he picked LBJ as a governing pick. He picked LBJ. My understanding is that they kind of hated each other.
They did hate each other. And
he picked LBJ because he would deliver Texas, and it was sort of a Machiavellian thing about keep your enemies closer. I've never heard that before, that he was picked because he was going to help him govern. I'm not saying it's wrong. I've just never heard it before.
Well, I think there is some evidence for that, but go ahead.
Okay, but I don't know. And I don't know anyone who can claim that they do know that McCain picked Palin purely for the political stuff. I mean, I know a lot of people say it's a gimmick and nothing but a gimmick and all of the rest. But it seems to me, one thing we kind of do know about McCain is that he does take this, I'm a maverick, I'm going to be about reform stuff seriously. We know this from, people that he's said this to personally. We know this on all sorts of levels. And it seems to me that if he does believe it, then Palin could actually be very useful in this regard, because she would be this popular figure who would have a very sort of compelling sort of Mrs. Smith Goes to Washington persona going up against Congress. Plus, she would be very useful as a liaison to the right, which McCain is definitely going to need for all the reasons you listed earlier. So, I mean, it doesn't seem obvious to me that she's not going to be useful in governing. She may not be, but all these people who seem to know for sure that's not the case, I don't think are not acting on a lot of evidence that's in the record.
Well, I mean, that's a reasonable point. I can see that she could be helpful in banging the drums for reform and liaising with the Christian right. But I guess I still basically see those more as political functions. I mean, she can be helpful to McCain in base management, playing the role that Karl Rove played for Bush, being the guy to talk to evangelical leaders all the time, make sure they're on board. And I think she could be a good public spokesman for him in trying to get support for his agenda. But actually, being an advisor to him in making difficult decisions, whether it's about Iran or Iraq or the stock market or whatever, that's where I just have a hard time imagining her adding a lot.
For now, I think that's a perfectly legitimate concern. I don't know that it's true about energy. I don't know that it's true about all sorts of other things. I mean, political advisors in White Houses are kind of useful. And I think, and let me just say again, because, he's sort of becoming my white whale. The idea that Biden is going to be this incredibly useful partner in the vice presidency, if he's so good at that stuff, why not make him Secretary of State? And I think
he might have been made Secretary of State.
Yeah, okay, and then Obama could have picked a better vice presidential candidate. Because I think Biden's a terrible pick, but I think that this idea that you get that presidents get their advice from their vice presidents about where to take their administration, is really, it's not even it's not even a Clinton Gore, it's not even a Gore Cheney thing. It's a purely Cheney thing.
No, Gore was important for Clinton, I think.
But there were also very sharp differences. I mean, there were competing political agendas. I mean, and I'm not saying that Gore wasn't influential in the Clinton administration. I totally concede that he was, but. The history of the vice presidency was, the reason why Cheney was really Bush's guy and so powerful was the counterintuitive reality that Cheney was never going to run for office. And, but certainly George H.W. Bush, who had the best resume probably of any vice president since, I don't know, John Adams or something, very impressive guy, particularly on foreign policy stuff. The ideological break between the Reaganites and the Bushies was intense, and we're just sort of. It seems to me we're inventing this, this criteria for the vice presidency that is very recent, a very recent vintage at least, and for Brooks to. I mean, basically, the way I read Brooks, the way I read a lot of these people, definitely from. Not so much Ramesh, to a certain extent Ross. The way I read a lot of these guys, and I'm very sympathetic to a lot of this, is that there's a lot of buyer's remorse about Bush. And there are a lot of people who feel burned, and a lot of people are like Roy Scheider, in Jaws 2, who says, to the town council, as God is my witness, I'm not going through that hell again. And the problem is that they're seeing Bush under every, bush and around every corner, and they're seeing it in Sarah Palin when I don't think it's really, at the very least, I don't think the evidence is there that she's Bush. And I think the argument that somehow the McCain presidency would be like the Bush presidency because of Sarah Palin, I think is just a non-starter. And yet you find it all over the place because these people are sort of have such battered spouse syndrome about Bush that they're just so terrified of the prospect of going through it again. And I don't think, whatever the pluses or minuses of the McCain administration, they're not going to be the same ones as the Bush administration.
Well, first of all, it's incredibly heartening for me to hear that all these important conservative intellectuals see the Bush administration as such a disaster. Welcome, come on in, the water's fine. And no, I mean, obviously you're right. You can't, I mean, the McCain administration will clearly be different than the Bush administration in lots of ways. It reminds me of that great Henry Kissinger line when his first press conference on Vietnam, they said, "Are you going to make the same old mistakes on Vietnam?" And he said, "No, we'll make new and creative mistakes on Vietnam." I'm sure it will be different in lots of ways, and I think we should have a conversation another day about how McCain and Palin are different and similar. You know Palin's story better than mine, so I'd be interested in that. My only point was that I think that the nature of the vice presidency has changed in the last two administrations. It has become a much more significant job. For better and for worse, and I think that the Palin pick suggests that I think with Biden that might well continue. I think with Palin it would stop. maybe that really won't matter very much. But you can't get around the fact that the vice president, that we do have I don't know what the percentage is, 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 5 vice presidents ascends to the presidency because of something happening to the guy in charge. And with McCain, it's more likely than an average. And I think you just kind of, although it's a cliched point, you kind of can't get around it.
Yeah, okay, but to be really honest, I think that's all fair. I mean, certainly from your perspective, I think it's all fair. The idea that somehow, I mean, there's also this, this is a debate. I don't want to get back to the Bush, debate, but I mean, there was this debate for a long time about whether or not, experience and credentials yields good judgment. And I think, from my perspective, I would rather have Sarah Palin as President of the United States 2 years in to the McCain years, right? Let's say, heaven forbid, something happens to McCain 2 years from now, and McCain takes over. I would rather have Palin taking over the presidency than Barack Obama taking it over in 60 days from now, and I certainly would rather it than Joe Biden taking over the presidency. I mean, all this talk about how he's so great on foreign policy, knows all the stuff on foreign policy. Obviously, you're more sympathetic to his views on foreign policy than I am, but this was a guy from a conservative perspective who was wrong about an enormous number of things, from the Contras to the sane freeze to to the war, to huge chunks of the war on terror stuff. I mean, Barack Obama says that the signature distinction that he has with Hillary Clinton is that he had the good judgment to oppose the Iraq War, and here's Joe Biden who supported the Iraq War. I mean, you can go down the list. The idea, from a liberal or conservative perspective, that Joe Biden has the correct judgment to be president or vice president of the United States is, to me, almost as hard to make on the merit, and maybe it's harder to make on the merits than it is to make that case about Sarah Palin.
Well, it's an interesting question. It might be another good topic for us to discuss who's been right or wrong on more things in the last 25 years, in foreign policy, John McCain or Joe Biden. And in some ways, we could never resolve it because you and I are not going to agree on some of these debates, like Contra Aid. But I needless to say, shocker, I don't read Biden's record as quite as grim as you do.
Well, you've always been sort of a sane freeze kind of guy. There's some people who actually credit the nuclear disarmament campaign as playing a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we can have that. There are also people who believe that tiny hamsters power our bodies by running on treadmills.
Yeah, well, these people have tenure, although that probably doesn't have much of an impact.
That doesn't work with me either.
All right,
Peter. Well, it's good to talk to you. We'll try to do it again next week.
Excellent.
And, keep hope alive.
Take care.